Catherine Murphy, Shane Cassells, Alan Kelly, Mark McSherry, Mary Lou MacDonald. That's the sequence the hands went up, okay? And Catherine Connolly. So, Catherine Murphy. So we'll try and be concise and put the questions in relation to the issue here before us.
Are you given a time limit in relation to the question?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I give each person 5 minutes. That includes questions and answers, so that's about 7 or 8. Let's see how we get on at the end of 7 or 8 series of 5 minutes. Right? That could be 40 minutes.
Yeah, the context of, I should say good morning, the context of the request for the report was a discussion that happened at that particular meeting. I was asking you in relation to the sale of some stations and essentially whether or not there was a proper evaluation, because we may need some of the accommodation at some point in the future, and essentially looked for the reason why some over others found their way onto the OPW list. There's a long list of stations that were, once it's decided a station is going to be sold, it goes to the OPW, and the OPW will have a list of stations that are sold and what was got for them. Step Aside, for example, never found its way onto that list, and there's probably others that never found their way onto that list. Essentially, the Garda Commissioner at the time told me that there was a difficulty with the increase in the number of personnel, that there would be accommodation issues. And the point I was making was, if we're going to sell something and then have to buy something back at a point where it's going to be more expensive to do it, that doesn't make sense. And that was that context that we were looking for the criteria. And so I know there were 6 stations, because I asked a question back in last November, and I'm at the reply, in the middle of the reply, it says the Deputy will also be aware that I have requested that the Garda Commissioner, while fully cognizant of her statutory functions in relation to the distribution of Garda resource in the state, to identify 6 stations for reopening on a pilot basis in line with the commitment in the programme for partnership government. The pilot scheme is intended to feed into a wider review in terms of what the policing authorities work and so on and so forth. Now, my understanding is that it's up to the Gardaí are the ones that decide what resources they need within a context of funding that's available. I mean, it is very valid for us to try and figure out what that criteria was, and that was what was being asked. We could find ourselves in a situation, and I reiterate, we could find ourselves in a situation, how are we going to know whether or not stations were sold that shouldn't have been sold if we don't know what the criteria was? And I think that was valid to ask. The second point I'd like to make, and I'd like your comment on it, or maybe I shouldn't ask for your comment on it. It's in August of this year, there was an article in the Examiner written by Gina McEnroe, and we're told, because if we don't understand the criteria, there's only one conclusion that we can draw. And in this article it says the then Taoiseach-elect told Shane Ross he would get, and this was an interview with John Halligan, he would help to get Step Aside Garda Station reopened, a move which weeks later the Alliance putative leader, it's very tiny print, announced with much publicity. Now, we just want to know if the stations are being opened for very good policing reasons, if it's to do with crime, if they're, the criteria. I think it's reasonable for us to know what that criteria is, and you must have known what that criteria was that day.
We've agreed 5 minutes. You've gone 3. If you want a response,
okay.
There's only 2.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And
okay. 2 minutes response, and then moving to Deputy Cassells.
Okay, Deputy. So I suppose to be useful to give a backdrop to the. First of all, there was the closure of stations that happened over a period of years, sometime from I think 2011 onwards. and that resulted in a total of 139 stations being closed across the country. And by the time of the programme for government, when this... Sorry?
139.
139 stations were closed as part of that programme, yes. So, and then they are obviously owned by the OPW, all of those stations, and they went back into their estate for them to do with whatever they...
So could I just stop you there? There's some stations didn't find the way onto the OPW list.
The 139 stations that were closed went back to the OPW.
Including Stepaside?
Everything, yeah, the whole estate that were closed as part of the earlier station closure programme. Of that...
Does the Commissioner mean 39?
No, 139, 139.
139 were closed?
Yes. We had 700 plus stations at that time.
Sorry.
And that station closure programme concluded with 139 being closed across the state. Of that 139, I think 60 were sold by the OPW. So when we look at the criteria based on the programme for government commitment to opening 6 on a pilot basis, which was to be part of a part of that initiative was also asking the policing authority, in conjunction with the inspectorate, to look at our rural, at our boundaries, at our district boundaries, and how they were drawn, and that this work may inform or in some way help them to come to conclusions in relation to how we distribute our resources around the state.
Okay, I have to stop now. I'm moving on now to Shane Cassells. 5 minutes.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach, and welcome to the Acting Commissioner, and to wish him well in his role. It certainly was one of the shortest opening statements we're ever likely to get at the PA.